Okay, let's begin. I am Lanice Antoine Shelley, and I'll be your host through constructive healing-based conversations designed to empower adoptees and the adoption curious. Through the lens of experts and lived experiences, we focus on alchemizing our stories into maximum social impact. These are the voices who could not speak when they were young.
You can still hear me though.
I can.
Okay. Yeah. I was like on the run, so this is good. I was doing some last minute research, I'll be honest.
Oh, were you?
Yeah,
Um,
a little bit.
s- so was I. I was researching too. And we can research as we talk too. And
Yay.
yeah, it's super chill.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be perfect. And as I said, I think it's important to hear a Chinese voice and a Chinese adoptee voice at that. I mean,
hmm
I could easily say how I feel about it, but it really doesn't matter how I feel about it. And because it doesn't affect me. And that's what my podcast is about, is amplifying the voices that it affects.
hmm
And I know it will be impactful to have you talk about what's happening in the adoption realm in China. So how are you?
I'm good. It looks like we're both having our tea and just chatting.
It is. It is a tea kind of day. Oh my gosh,
Oh
it's
yeah.
snowing. There's like a foot
That's
of snow outside.
because are you in Chicago or Colorado? I feel like it was a C place. It just makes me think it starts with a C, but I could
You're
be
right.
completely wrong.
You're right about that. I'm in Chicago.
Chicago. Okay. I was like, wait, yes. Okay. I remember hearing that on your show. I was like, I think you said Chicago, Illinois.
Yeah, Chicago, which was ironic because yesterday I was chatting with a friend and I said, I'm so glad it's not going to snow for quite some time. And she said, Lenise, it's snowing tomorrow, like 2 feet.
Yep.
And I was on my bike. Like I
Ooh.
ride my bike year round. So I got on my bike 3 blocks away from my house. It was like a blizzard, could barely see in front of me. And I forgot my
Right?
scarf. And I was too stubborn to turn back and put another layer on. It was intense. Um, but
Boy.
I'd love to know a little bit more about you.
Yeah,
So
sure.
when did you arrive here? When were you adopted?
Yes, I arrived to the US at age like 4.5, almost five. I pretty much was almost 5 years old. And I came through adoption, international adoption, to a family that already had two biological sons. And I grew up in Maryland. And now I currently live in New York City. So,
Okay,
yeah, a brief,
awesome.
a very brief, but I can get more detailed, but we'll see.
Only say what you want to say. There's no coercion here. So you're working with an adoptee, a Chinese adoptee organization. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you do with them?
Sure. So I would say I work more independently I
Mhm.
feel like I work with all the adoptee organizations in a sense of that's where I talk to a lot of other adoptees and especially the ones that are specific with Chinese adoptees. But the podcast itself is actually just something that I personally do. I think it's more of like a personal journal, individual project that I started pandemic times, as many of these podcasts I believe were born of the
Yes,
pandemic.
mine was born during
Yours
that
was too?
time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I was like, you have a more consistent trajectory, so I just think it's been longer, but because you were talking about burnout, and I was like, really? Oh yeah, I guess that's true too. Like we all have
Oh
been
yeah,
there.
it's been 4 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. We have lasted the 4 years. That was pretty surprising to get past even just 1 year, to be honest.
Oh, absolutely. I concur. That's exactly how I feel. And it feels like it's been a century that I've been working on this podcast.
Oh yeah.
Because you just
Yes.
inch along.
So born out of the pandemic. How many people support?
Yeah.
I would say last I checked, there was like a consistent like 80 subscribers, they might say. Like I guess 80 people who follow the show uh
Really?
over
That's
the four
great.
years. I don't know if it's more, but it might just be like 80 people consistently who have followed. But I don't know. Maybe it's increased. Maybe it hasn't changed because similar to you, I think I felt the desire to take breaks. So when you're not sharing as consistently, sometimes like it falls off. But of course, with the recent development of the policy and law changes, there's been like another, what is it, like a spike of interest amongst Chinese adoptees, especially those who are in that, I feel like that age range of like 17 even, maybe even a little younger, but I would say average is like 17 to 24. I'm hearing a lot more questions and feedback from them too. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a huge following because it takes a long time for podcasts to launch and
hmm
even longer for the hosts to find their footing, especially if it's a smaller podcast. If you only have a handful of people supporting you or just an army of one, like it's my case, it's an army of one. Do you have anyone else helping you edit, produce on your end?
No, Army of One also here too. I would say the format that I've done the show is so very specific, and who I speak to, it's like such a specific audience that I feel like I've kind of given myself a little bit less of a challenge. Whereas I know like on your show and other shows where you have like experts from all different backgrounds and people that come through, like that's I feel like harder because you're like reaching out with diverse backgrounds, you're doing a lot more research probably. Whereas I'm like, I don't necessarily have to do as much research, but I do have like like a format that I use, and then I let the other person just talk more. So it's like, okay, yeah, this works for me.
I love it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I think I made it easy, but it's not, I
You
mean, it's
know?
still challenging to do it
Yeah.
all yourself. Exactly. Edit, produce, promote. But probably because both of our shows are born in the pandemic, we might have had a little bit of a bump in the sense of getting people's attention. And there was a lot more awareness around, I mean, of course, like all the movements of like AIPI, Stop Asian Hate, and Black Lives Matter, like it all really just increased again during the pandemic when you notice there was a lot more just, well, I guess it's not just because of the pandemic. It was prior to the pandemic with our lovely United States of America uh democracy. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's the pandemic just really emphasized a lot more need or feeling of wanting to hear like our voices out there too. So,
Which is great because
mhm,
I feel that a lot of the cultural wars are between Black and white people, and there's so much more nuance between, there's contention sometimes between people of color, like the Asian
mhm.
community and Black community.
Yeah.
There's a lot of contention in that, uh, on those borders of cultural differences, and it's
Mhm.
unfortunate. I just had the epiphanal thought quite recently of adoptees emulating the social construct that we were raised up in.
Mhm.
So many of us were raised in white communities
Right.
where we rarely saw an Asian person, we rarely saw a Black person or a Hispanic person. And then we grow up to create the same kind of homogenous corners of the world
Yes.
again. And it was
Even
just
within
like,
adoption communities. Yes. I
exactly.
heard you talking about this on a recent, like a very recent episode you posted, but it was like
Yeah.
it was really, I guess, satisfying to hear someone else say it too. Like even within adopted communities, it does seem like there is a bit more of like all of the Colombian adoptees and like Latin American adoptees come together and like they all like have their own little group, and then all the Korean adoptees have their little thing, and then like Chinese adoptees. And I was like, wow, someone else is noticing that too. And I think it's like I've noticed it over the past couple years, because I haven't been too much in the community, especially the past couple years, but in general, just understanding more and seeing that too. It's like, oh yeah, we really are also separating even amongst ourselves. And I don't know if that's necessarily intentional or it's just like a comfort of knowing um those people. And I mean I say that in a sense of like it's a hypocritical way of saying it because like the podcast I have is Chinese adoptee focus, right?
Mhm.
So like the whole purpose was, and I think at the time when all of these podcasts were born in the pandemic, I just didn't see one that was like Chinese adoptees. I saw a lot about adoption, mostly I think like no, it's not international when it's within the nation. Domestic.
Domestic. Yeah.
Yes. That word. Domestic adoption. There was a lot about that, but not necessarily about international adoption. There was a couple about like adoptees in Korea because I think a lot of them are like older, so they're like more in tune with their adoption. But it's like, where's the one for like Chinese adoptees? I mean, I also didn't talk to many adoptees prior to pandemic times too, so that's just my personal take of like, oh, it's really interesting to see that like we do, and I think we are starting to now that it's been a few years post-pandemic time where groups are really trying to encourage more intermixing and like why like we all have very similar experiences as adoptees, even if we are from various countries and adopted here, essentially.
I agree. And that's why my podcast focuses on internationally adopted people,
Yeah,
just to
from
bring us all
everywhere.
together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they are from everywhere. And there are a lot of people from Korea. I think Korean adoptees are more prevalent than Chinese adoptees. I had to
Sure.
do some digging to find Chinese adoptees to come on the podcast and talk about what's happening. But yeah, to your point about the interracial kind of crisis that we have in the adoption community, because I do agree that it is comfort that we are seeking. Like when I found Haitian adoptees, I just latched on to them and
Mm-hmm.
celebrated the fact that they looked like me. You mentioned
Right.
that you didn't see or hang out with that many adoptees before the pandemic. Why
Mm-hmm.
was that, and what kind of created the impetus for the shift for you to hang out with more adoptees? Was it your podcast? Because it was for me.
That was a huge way. It was like a catalyst or like the way to open dialogue with people. Because I think it was not necessarily just the podcast, but it was more the intrigue or interest in my own identity and how do I feel about connecting with Chinese culture, that the whole identity crisis that we all go through, doing like the Rosie Riveter position. But it's the whole identity part too. But also, I do think a big part of it was just coming to that point in it was honestly, it's cliche, but it's also thinking like getting to age 25. It's like, okay, I've lived now a quarter of my life here, uh, or just about 20 years of living my life here in the US, but I'm now alive for about quarter, 25 years, right? Because there's a point where we get to a point where we're going to be closer to death than we are to birth, right? So
Mhm.
a lot of that was curiosity with how do I feel about my own self? Clearly, there's some intuition or gut feeling that I'm dealing with because I feel differently. And then I also had the estrangement with my parents had started right before the pandemic. It was actually in 2019 where things were getting pretty tense. And then up until 2023, we didn't really have a relationship to the estrangement of 3 years. So the podcast was a way to help like find that community and find other people, um, and just hear other experiences too. I did have one friend that I made because of social media too. And we have been friends for about 6 years. So she was the only person I had ever really spoken with because I was going back to China. That's why I looked. It's like, hey, people going back to China. And in the search that popped up, this person's post came up and she had gone to China 2 or 3 years prior. Her post came up after 6 months. It was there for 6 months and it just appeared again. So whatever the algorithm works, I guess that's the reason we became friends. But that was the big thing is the podcast and also just hearing other people's experiences of uh, what they're going through. And honestly, I did seek out others who were also not having the best of relationship with their adoptive like parents too or adoptive parent. I knew I was subconsciously seeking that too. It's like there's a comfort in knowing there's other people who are also going through estrangement, and the relationship with my parents is better now, but that was a huge reason that I was like, okay, I'm gonna start this podcast, one, because I can tell my relationship with my parents is not going well. And this is an opportunity for me to talk to other people. I also didn't have a job. And well, I mean, like present day, I still don't have like a full-time 9 to 5 gig. I call it a gig. Job, I actually have many gigs. So there's a difference of depending what you do in your work too, is like people speak about differently. But
Are
uh,
you an artist or an entertainer adjacent person?
yes, essentially. Yes. That's what I put in my
Okay.
taxes.
Okay.
Artist.
Okay. That's
Mhm.
why you say gig. So what do you do?
Yes. Yes. So I am full time. I'm basically a art model. So I'm the person that people draw for their art classes, or
I've done
are you
that
also,
too.
you're not right?
Yeah,
Well,
I've done that too.
I was like, and you're like your yoga teacher, but I was like, it seemed like you also had other gigs too, apart from, and then this again, you do for your passion too. So I was like, oh, we have a lot in common.
I know. We
Really glad we
do.
haven't talked. Well, I was like, we haven't talked before. I did
We
email you. I was like, I'm nervous. I'll be honest.
I know, I
But
saw that. A lot of people email me that before they come on. Sometimes it's their first podcast ever, or they're just not used to being the interviewee.
interviewee, that's more
And
that. Yeah.
yeah, and so because you have a podcast, so you're comfortable talking to people, but just like
hmm
being interviewed is a completely different sensation. Totally. So
Yes.
I get that. But yeah, my full-time job, what I have degrees in is, and I'm an actor, I'm a director, I
Okay.
paint as well, and I write as well. But over the past year, I have just been in the wellness world because the art industry was halted because of the pandemic, because of the strikes. And so I had to seek a day job that I liked myself in, that felt authentic to me. And since I'm always at the yoga studio anyways, it was a natural transition to become an instructor. But that's what I normally do. And every once in a while, I get whisked away to do a show. I do TV and film.
hmm
But but I really love the wellness world, and it's expanded me in
Yeah.
many ways. You know, I want it to be a vehicle for adoptees as well. So not just for me in my
Yes.
healing, but to offer it as a vehicle for healing for adoptees. So just launching initiatives for them to come to take yoga, go to retreats with me, that sort of thing.
Right.
It at an accessible price is, or
hmm
free, is what my aim is and what I've been focusing on for the
Right.
adoptee advocacy work that I do.
hmm That's wonderful. Yeah, movement is just such a powerful thing to really help alleviate a lot of like the anxiety you feel, just like breathing, honestly. Like I think the one of the shows, or maybe I'm not sure if it's all of your shows, but you were like, let's all just take a grounding breath. And I was like, oh yes, let's all do that. And it's like
Yeah.
consciously doing it while listening. It's like, huh, that's a really good
Yeah.
idea to like everybody take a breath. I mean, I also think of that too when it's like running. Um, so you're a cyclist, you're a yoga teacher. Are you also a runner? Are you a
I
like
used to be. I
I
have a
used
lot
to
of,
be.
yeah, I have a lot of injuries from dance. Dancers just start to break off and fall apart. And
I believe
that's
it.
what my body is doing. And I hold her up with duct tape and she does what I want her to do. But outside
Yeah.
of that, I do what I can. But tell me more about your modeling for, do you do it for sculpture and also for
All
painting or
things.
visual
All
arts?
things. Oh, most of them are drawing. So I do modeling for, I think primarily it's drawing. But you're talking about acting, which is really funny because, but very recently I've had two classes where they wanted a lot of facial expressions held for longer times than you normally would. I mean, because
Mhm.
I have a lot of facial expressions, of course, but then holding it for like 5 minutes. But that became a
That's
more
hard.
recent thing. It's hard. And someone was like, "You're phenomenal. You're one of the best." It's like, oh, they're like, "This is the start of your acting career." I was like, I don't know. It seems really overwhelming to like do this. So, but primarily drawing, so like charcoal and pencil, and then painting sometimes, especially for the undergraduate degree or graduate degree students, they'll do that. And then sculpting I haven't done recently, but I have done sculpting. Sculpting is fun because they turn you like on this table. I'm sure if you've experienced that
Yeah.
too. You're like on a
Yeah,
little
it's
table and then
weird
it turn
though.
it's weird.
Have you done it nude?
Oh yeah, it's primarily nude.
Okay, because that's what I was gonna ask. Because when I've modeled for sculpting class, they turn you on that pedestal, and you're like,
Yeah.
and you're nude, and you're like, okay. But
Yeah.
it was very freeing for me. Like
Oh,
it, I
yeah.
worked through a lot of insecurities being a
Mm-hmm.
model for sculpt classes because I was just like, most of the students were retirees. So I was just like,
Yes.
what are you gonna say about this body? What are you gonna say? But
Mm-hmm.
but it sounds like you have students.
Yes. So I do a lot of modeling at uh, I do modeling at a lot of universities. And then I also model at like private studios and art centers. But the universities, like they have classes that are like anatomy focused. So my primary role is all nude. This occasionally they're like, hey, we need you to wear clothes. And I'm thrown off because I don't understand that concept sometimes. I started out at like a community center clothed, and then they were like, hey, you can get paid more and do this nude. And I was like, okay. And I've always enjoyed not dressing up or having to like configure outfits and things. So that's how I ended up doing nude. And then there are people occasionally that I have run into that have like made it very uncomfortable. And then it's like, I just don't want to work with that instructor again. I let the like coordinator know, or I just don't accept or respond to their inquiries. But um, it's always interesting because I'm in New York City. So when I say that, people are like, "Oh, that's so cool," or "That's so unique," and it's like we're in New York, and then they're like, "Oh, we are in New York City." I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
like it's really not too, I guess, out of the box here, but it's everywhere too. It's not just New York City. Like everywhere, people are. You have models for classes, and um, I mean, other great art institutions are across the U.S. and across the world. So, and then Europe, of course, that's where it's originated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, I want to get to this conversation about the Chinese adoption laws and how they have
Yeah.
shifted within the last
Hmm.
year or so.
Yeah.
And I just want to say to you listening at home, I am fully aware that Tara is not the sole representative of Chinese culture or laws or anything like that. But it was imperative to have a Chinese adoptee be here for this moment, be the voice for this moment, and lead us into this conversation. So thank
Mhm.
you so much for being brave enough to come
Mhm.
on here and help educate myself and everyone else about what's happening because we all are curious,
Right.
but um, a lot of us just don't have access. Either we don't know a Chinese adoptee or we just don't know where to look for this information.
Right.
So I'm really excited to have this conversation and find out more.
Yeah, I
So what did
agree.
you find?
So I actually backtracked it. I actually was looking up because I'm aware this has happened where it went from like the one child policy to two, and then they lifted it entirely. So I was like, I know this happened recently. So I went back and looked up the years. So
Hmm.
2016 is when they lifted the one child policy, so you could have two. Because I believe this is all connected into the most
Oh, it
recent
is.
development, right? And
Wait, did you see the One Child Nation documentary?
I couldn't finish, I'll be honest. So I'm so glad you
Okay.
prefaced with like I'm the like Tara's not. I was like, no, I'm definitely no expert. There are definitely a handful of adoptees who I've spoken to who they spend years doing research about this, like 3 or 4 years in their undergraduate writing thesis statements and graduate like I don't know how they do it, but a lot of respect because it's so in depth to like get involved and like look at the research and also like watching a documentary like One Child Nation. I couldn't do it. It was really just sad and depressing. It's like, all right, well, I'm
It
good.
is intense. It is sad and
Hmm.
depressing on numerous levels, especially with the women's rights. In respect to women's rights,
Yes.
it's extremely frustrating because of the forced sterilization, the forced
Right.
abortions, all of those things. So, Yeah, but what did you find?
So I found, so it's 2016 was the year that one child policy was lifted, so you could have two in a home essentially. And then 2021 is when they lifted it, so they didn't have a restriction on the amount of children in a home. So that's recent, right? 2016, 2021, and of course
Mm-hmm.
2024. So I will credit one resource. It's called the Nanchang Project, spelled Nanchang. They are a nonprofit organization. It's I'm pretty confident it's like Adoptee founded and Adoptee research. So all those adoptees who I know or who I've spoken to who do a lot of research have contributed into blogs and other resources, and they have it all listed, which is really helpful. But they were the one that was like, okay, I'm gonna read this blog that with the policy. So I did learn that it is actually August 28th is when they notified where they just stopped accepting applications or any that were in process. And then it was
August 28th of this year.
of this year. Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's so recent.
Mm-hmm. And then it was actually on August, no, I'm sorry, September 4th is when essentially everybody was notified about it. Uh, like not just the families, but it became news, right? I think it was on all the news websites. And that's when I noticed it was also a big spike in interest of people asking about uh, adoption, essentially, too. Okay, so I wrote this down because it's like, all right, so any pending applications and future applications will not be processed unless it is stepchildren or biological relatives within 3 generations. So those are the only applications that will be looked at. So essentially it was like internationally the ban. There's no more adoption for international adoption. So any family who had a pending application or was on a wait list or something for years, it just basically is void from what I understood. And any future applications that were coming in, they are like, we're not accepting them. But for within China, if you have application for like a stepchild, I guess, or relatives within 3 generations, which I guess that's what, 30 years back. So doing that math, I was like, oh, that makes sense because the one child policy really went into effect in the 1980s. So it's been about what, 40 years? 80, 90, 2000. Yeah, 40, 40, 44, 45 years. So that's those are the numbers. So I had to look that up.
You know how common domestic adoptions are in China?
I don't know how common domestic adoptions are, but fostering actually was a pretty prevalent thing. Like there was a lot of like fostering within China. I actually only learned that recently too. I didn't realize that there was families that were still fostering um abandoned babies essentially. But within China, I'm not sure how common domestic adoption was too. Mostly because I think I have a lens, and maybe a lot of us do, of like only the international stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a good question. I really wonder that too. I feel like I want to write that down. Like domestic adoption.
Swinging back to the one child mandate, why did they end the one child mandate in 2016?
I would say because it was like putting that in was a like all economic decision in the 1980s. And then in 2016, I think that's when they started to see a decline in the ability of essentially like repopulating China too, of like Chinese blood, I guess, quote unquote. So I think 2016 is when they were like, I think even leading up to 2016, like the early 2000s into 2016, from what I understand too, what I've heard was the parameters or requirements to adopt became more strict, or it was like it's harder essentially. Like there's a more that you had to meet in your background or like demographic or specifics. So even up until even the early 2000s into then 2016, the amount of international adoptions actually declined substantially. And then of course 2020 with the pandemic, it was just paused, right? And then 2024, I guess we'll get into that too, but it was like kind of just like, all right, completely done. Like, oh, okay. I guess it went from pausing to just stop. It's almost like pause, play, stop. Like, nope, just stop. So that was like I guess like economically like I think it's more just like a traditional, we were talking about being raised in like certain cultural acceptances in America, and I was like, well, we know like other countries such as China have a lot more preference for like male born uh babies too. And I think that's actually like in many countries. It's not just China. Like you hear of that in a lot of other countries too. So,
You're
that's
right
like a
about that.
unifying thing. Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
a unifying thing. Hey,
Unfortunately, yeah, it's one of the greatest equalizers culturally is the obsession with male lineage.
male lineage and disliking
And
women.
yeah, yeah,
Honestly, though.
and devaluing women
Mm-hmm.
and girls. I have in front of me some of the qualifications to adopt here,
Mm-hmm.
and they may vary slightly depending on
Mm-hmm.
state, but generally speaking, you have to be married for at least 2 years. If
Mm-hmm.
neither applicant has been divorced, limit of 2 divorces in total. If previously married, the length of the current marriage has to be at least 5 years. Applicants should be between 30 and 55 years old.
Okay.
Applicants should have a high school or equivalent education level. Combined income should total at least $10,000 for each family
Mm.
member, including the adopted child. A net worth of $80,000. And if you're a single mother, a single female, it has to be a net worth of $100,000. No more than 5 children in the home under the age of 18 years old, the youngest being at the least 3 years old. Applicants should have no history of criminality or drug use. Applicants should be physically and mentally healthy, no antidepressants for the past 2 years. The couple should have good medical insurance that will cover the adopted child's medical needs. And I believe the applicants need to be heterosexual.
And that's just domestically?
This is the US um, eligibility to adopt in China.
Oh, okay. I was like, no, that sounds about yes, that sounds about right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like
I
each
like
thing
how
was added almost. It's very comprehensive and
it's
very
very comprehensive.
mm-hmm.
And I actually like that, even though it is not inclusive to LGBTQIA couples.
Right.
However, the requirements from the US is definitely more scant than that. You can be as young as 25 years old and adopt.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wild.
And your income can be around $15,000.
Right.
So there's a huge disparity between the requirements that the Chinese government has installed and what Americans view is necessary to raise a
Right.
child. And that was interesting
Mm-hmm.
to me when I was looking that up. And I think that screams volumes of American culture and how they think, how much they think children need or don't need to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Wow. Because I believe when my parents adopted me personally, they were was that like it was like 30 to 50 was what you read? I think they were in that middle bracket. And but I don't think I was considered necessarily a child with special needs or a medical history, because there's a lot of adoptees I know when I speak to them, they're like, "Oh, I was considered a child with severe medical like attention or needed because of this or that." And then I also was older, so I was 4, which meant it was like not as desirable because they wanted babies. So I think being older, they might have. I don't know if this is true, but depending where you go or who you speak with or whatever resources say, but it could be like if you were having a child that was older, your application might have been um ahead of ones that were looking for like infants like 6 months or 6 to 12 months essentially. So, but my parents were also a little bit older. They were in that middle, that bracket, but it just seems like and they're probably after, because that was 1998. And then I'm sure in 2000 is when they added like, you have to have no mental health past or something. Because I'm pretty sure that was not a requirement in 1998, but
No, I
between the two
highly
of us, we have
doubt.
some good stuff. We got some good stuff.
Yeah, we do. We did our research. Thank you very much. Yeah, in the 80s, they weren't talking about mental health
Right.
as much as they are now. I think the whole conversation around mental health
Mm-hmm.
has taken to the forefront the past 10, 15 years, even though many people have been doing talk therapy, but now people
Right.
understand that it is the root of a lot of violence, the root of a lot of mistreatment or
Right.
unhousing of people in ways
Mm-hmm.
that they weren't recognizing before.
Oh yeah. And yeah, I think you meant in the requirements too, because we were talking about LGBTQI, like I do think they must have, I don't know how they found it, but there are definitely more couples of like same gender couples or same identifying gender couples too. I've talked to quite a few adoptees who are probably around my age too. Um, because I'm 31, and that's kind of the older, I would say the quote unquote older part of the bracket of like Chinese adoptees. And a lot of adoptees who I speak to who are basically between like 27 to 30s, um, a fair number of them actually have like same sex like parent, so like two female, two male. And I don't know if maybe the requirements hadn't got that strict yet, or they were able to find agencies that were able to help, like, hey, you do meet these other requirements even if you aren't considered like a heterosexual couple or something. So
I
it
wonder
really
what
must
state
be
they were in. They
dependent.
were probably in a
That's a good
state
point.
that was open to
Oh,
gay marriage. Yeah,
that
because a lot
that
of
would
these
probably, yep.
Christian-led
Yes.
agencies are going to be discriminating.
Yes, that's a good, I think you're right. A lot of them are from New York.
Well,
So
there you
yeah,
have it.
there you
Yeah.
go. Epiphany or that's something new to learn. Like, oh yeah, like New York. I mean, I grew up in like liberal areas. I grew up in Maryland too. So it's like I you were talking about ignorance earlier. It's like, oh yeah, there's like a reverse side of that. I don't know what it's called, but it's like so accustomed to diversity and same sex, like gay marriage and
Yeah.
everything. And then going to places that don't accept that or don't have a lot of diversity. So it's like, I guess there's an ignorance of not understanding that there are places that don't have this too. So it's like, oh, that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. I have my blinders on. I think we all did. And then the election happened, and it was
Oh my gosh.
riveting because of that, because we were in our echo chambers of people who believed what we thought was more prevalent than it was.
Yes.
And then the election happened, and the shock of that was bone
Right.
crushing for so many people because we had our blinders on. We could
Mm-hmm.
not conceive that there were
Yeah.
numerous people out there that didn't believe in equality to the depth that we
Right.
believed in it.
Right. It was like, oh, okay. And a lot of people, again, you're right, depending where you are. Because you're in Chicago, so that's like city, a pretty like metropolitan area, right? Of
Yes, yes. Illinois is blue, so I
oh
think
that, yeah.
adoption in Illinois is more lax than, say, Utah or
Right. Some like
or
north of, yeah.
Kansas or Oklahoma. But there were
Yeah.
quite a few agencies that I looked up that were Christian based, and
Yeah.
um, and those ones are discerning, and they will be more discerning
Oh yeah.
come the next year, and they're able to discriminate
Oh my
without any
goodness.
kind of repercussions. So it's
Ooh.
going to be scary for those adoptive parents that are still seeking to adopt, and it's going to be even scarier for the adoptee out there,
Mm-hmm.
because more often than not, we are brought into all white homes and communities. Were
Right.
you the only adoptee in your household?
Yes, yes. So my two older brothers, they had two biological sons, so we were each 4 years apart. So it was kind of like that difference of, so between me and my oldest sibling, it's 8 years. I mean, that seems like a really big gap for siblings, but yes, I was the only adoptee in my household.
And in your household, do you feel that they brought in Chinese culture at all?
Oh yeah. Yeah, they definitely did. I actually do appreciate that my dad was studying Mandarin and was taking classes. He's a big traveler too, so he encouraged us going back to China when I was around like 11 years old. And then my middle brother, my middle sibling, came with us for that trip. And then just like New Year's or like Chinese festivals, we would recognize and celebrate those a little bit. And I also did Chinese like traditional dance growing up
Oh,
too.
how beautiful.
Yeah, there was a lot of I didn't last past age 16 because age 16. But I definitely I always had the influence of like Chinese culture too. The hard part really was talking more about the adoption aspect, not necessarily like the cultural thing. Both my parents were very like welcoming and open and like showing like this is a part of you that exists too. But it could very well be just the language, especially for my mom, of like articulating more about like the adoption aspect. I think it just didn't hit the same way. And then my dad started to articulate a little bit more, but not too much when I was 18. So I think, I mean, I don't know. I attribute that maybe to also like a generation difference too. Like both my parents are in the boomer generation. So I was like, you're nodding. He's like, I don't know if your parents were too. So it's like,
Oh, mine
yeah,
definitely. Yeah.
yeah.
So I
So
get
there's
it.
like a whole, yeah. So it's like,
They're not as introspective. And that's not a
mhm,
shade to anyone listening. It's just
exactly.
generationally, we go through these cultural phenomenons. And the one that's
Hmm.
happening now is kind of the woke, quote unquote, phenomenon.
Right,
Even though I hate, unfortunately, I hate the word now that it's been co-opted by conservatives who don't quite respect or understand it. But
right.
the boomer generation is a generation where they just like, sucked it up and didn't talk or complain about
Hmm.
anything. And so when they see us speaking up, being loud, advocating for ourselves, it sounds
Right.
violent to them.
Hmm. Exactly, exactly. So, and I understanding that too, and also growing up a little bit myself. I mean, they say I think it's like 25, your brain hasn't fully developed until 25 or like right around 25, 26. So it was when I was 26 where I was starting to like really become more introspective and understand more of like that identity. There's definitely psychological terms about this too, but like the ego and the like super ego and all that stuff too. Sure you have an expert who's talked about it, but I was like, yeah, something related to that. I listened to many podcasts about other experts talking about this, but it's very relatable because now after 4 years is when I realized, oh, like that's just I understand like or I accept and understand like this is how my parents how they grew up and like thinking about they're also human. So that made it much easier to like, okay, well, we can have our own relationship in our own way. I think there's a lot of like 3 years of change and different patterns and habits I've developed. So now it's like, all right, we're gonna have to find out how to have a relationship now that I've like shifted away and I do things differently than before this happened, right? But it definitely was challenging to in a way, I feel like I found that solace with talking to other adoptees who did have open conversation with their parents. Because there was definitely some that I spoke with and they're like, "Oh no, my parents were actually very open about talking about the adoption aspect." And because it was one of those like because people will ask, I mean, sure, you have gone to too. It's like, when did you know you were adopted? It's like, I didn't really need to be told.
I know.
It's pretty clear that I was not born, but um, there's a lot of it was really nice to hear like other people's experiences where they were saying that, oh, since I was young, like we would go to like very adoption specific like camps are a thing, and I'm like, what? There's a camp for this? Or not that my parents would have sent me to the camp, but I was just like, whoa, I don't even know if I would want to go to that camp, let's be honest. But it just sounds like, oh, a sleepaway camp where you talk about your adoption and cry a bunch. That sounds, and you're sleeping in a cabin. That just doesn't sound as appealing. But apart from that, it was, it was surprising at first, but also really comforting to know. It's like, oh yeah, okay, so there are like a lot of people who just, we all have a variety of experiences too. So that helped a lot with like understanding. And then a big reason the podcast came to be.
So when you found out about the Chinese laws being altered, what were
Mhm.
your initial feelings? And then what were the feelings that you heard from any of your Chinese adoptee friends?
Oh yeah. So for me personally, I honestly was like, I'm not that surprised. And it didn't, for me, it didn't also, I also didn't feel like a huge shift or like need to do something about it right away, because the other policies had been lifted, and then them stopping at like China stopping international adoption, foreign adoptions essentially. It just didn't come as that big of a surprise because of the other things that had been happening leading up to now in the 2000s. Others I've heard from, a lot of people were really upset, and completely valid. Like I understand, like a lot of people were really upset. The biggest part was also, what about going back to China? So if they're stopping foreign applications and everything, what about going back to China? And that was the biggest reaction I noticed for people too. It's like there was like a big interest in going back to China, and also a big interest in hearing other adoptees too. So that's actually where I did see like a big spike in people coming and listening to like episodes of this podcast, of the Adoptees Born in China podcast, where people were like, "Oh, now I want to hear these like other people talk about it because they just stopped adoption, and now I'm like, wait, but I'm a part of that, or I'm a product of that." So a lot of adoptees I spoke with were like, now I want to hear more of other stories, and also, well, what do I do? I want to go back. Like, are they gonna let me come back? That was the biggest one. It's like, are they gonna let me in? And I think with that, so actually in the same article that I was reading from the Nanchang Project, it was saying specifically when it comes to a root search or like a birth search, um, you would want to speak to the relevant Chinese authorities specifically. So I guess that depends on the area related to, can you go back, or like what are the parameters for going back. So that was I think that was a helpful thing to actually make a note of too, because going back to China, in general, we all have to have visas, of course, and visas were on pause during the pandemic, and then they resumed it. But then, if you're an adoptee wanting to go back to China and go back to your specific like welfare institute or the area that you were adopted from, each region or each like province, and then within the province, there's probably like what the article was saying is like, gotta ask your local Chinese authorities because there might be specific rules that they have that another region wouldn't have. But I imagine this must be the case across like all countries, all international, like all countries everywhere. Like depending where you go, there's certain practices or policies that they follow. So I think that was the big one. It's like everybody, I'm sure there was a really large influx of adoptees filling out visa forms because it just opened too. Of like, all right, let me get my visa because it should be good for 14 years, I want to say, when you fill out a visa application and get approved.
That's interesting because when I've seen a few Chinese adoptees on TikTok talking about the shift in laws, they were upset. And I didn't quite
Hmm.
understand why, and the way that you explained it helped me understand.
Hmm.
Because from my perspective, as someone who is aware of the trafficking aspect of adoption,
Right.
aware of one child nation, the horrors of that mandate, I
Hmm.
was surprised when people were upset that
Hmm.
this was happening. I thought that people would rejoice that no
Mm,
longer was the Chinese government allowing for the trafficking of their children.
right.
But you're saying that they saw it from the perspective of access. What
Mm-hmm.
will adoptees be barred from because of these laws? So that's interesting. That's a really
Mm,
interesting take for me.
yeah. Because there are definitely some that had that shared the same perspective of like, okay, well, there was like a bit of like a trafficking and like the really dark sides of course, like international adoptions. And then there was a lot of empathy actually that I personally resonated with it too. My first thought was also like, well, all these pending applications for families who do want children, not necessarily to like give them a better life or something like that, but for those families who do genuinely wanted to adopt a child who was abandoned and then their applications are completely like voided. Um, I personally really felt like for those people too, because we were just talking about like our parents and like them being humans too. It's like I don't know the scenario of exactly what every applicant had or all the pending applications were. Um, but it also occurred to me as like, wow, for all these people who had been putting in the time and effort to adopt and then their applications completely voided, it's like that's like 2 years or 3 years just down the drain essentially of like all that effort. So that was a part that I resonated with too. Apart from like, okay, I'm not really shocked this is happening, but it seems like why wouldn't they at least let the pending applications go through? And just stop accepting them as of what, August 28th? Like it just seems a little bit unfair for those people who might have had applications and been waiting for because of the pandemic too. This is 2024. It was 2021 when they lifted the policy altogether of how many children you could have in the household. So, and because the pandemic paused everything, so there could very well be people who had applications for more than 3 years. I wouldn't be surprised if it was on pause since 2020. So I definitely felt for those people too, because there are a lot of, and I don't know if like other adoptees would agree. Of course, just speaking from my own experience and my own perspective, but I felt that empathy, and there was a few others who I spoke to, and they're like, that sucks." And I was like, "Yeah, it does. That also sucks in that way too, right? Like, I understand for us, we're thinking about what do we do when we go back, or if we want to go back. Um, a lot of it, a lot of the reactions too, I would say, are people just having interest in exploring like the whole Chinese identity or like that aspect of just like, okay, well, now that it's like, oh, I guess the facing that reality of like, well, now in, oh my gosh, 2024, it's like in 2048, there's gonna be no like Chinese adoptees. Is that it? Which is kind of like surreal, I think, for all of us too, because we find the community and solace and comfort of like meeting another adoptee, right? Um, like I guess speaking from like a Chinese adoptee perspective, like, oh, it's so much comfort in finding another one of you out there in the wild and being able to talk. But then in like 20 years, it's like, whoa, we're not gonna like meet anymore. Like there won't be any more children that are like gonna be adopted from China. Like, is it just become like a blip in the history? I guess. So I think that was a small reaction too that I noticed or I also had of like, we're like the last ones. So like,
Mhm. I noticed that reaction too. I just want to
yeah,
add one
okay.
variable
Yeah.
because someone mentioned that, and that's a sensation that I may never know as a Haitian woman. And
Mm,
um, or maybe it does exist, but it hasn't come out that Haiti is no longer doing international adoptions. A lot of things are happening in Haiti right now. So I wouldn't be
mm-hmm.
surprised if something as just monumental of like that came out.
Right.
But the other variable that I think is important is the the families who are losing the child, that
Yeah.
variable.
Yeah.
And do they now have the opportunity to, one, keep their child, or to two, learn to parent better or get the resources that they need to maintain their family unit? I'm
Mm,
curious as to whether China has implemented laws for families to stay together,
Right.
have
That's
created social systems to support the family unit so that they do not need to resort to
mhm.
adoption.
Right. You have definitely articulated those questions that I have definitely thought of. I've thought of that too, because I wondered because we don't hear about those laws and if there are any, um, what exactly they are. This is like a call out to anybody who does know specifically, because I genuinely I could try to I was trying to search a little bit about that like a
Yeah, I was
couple
looking
weeks
this
ago.
up
I was
right
like,
now.
and I was like, is there anything in China like laws related to because I guess it's like it's almost like we're all still feeling the effects. I mean, I think also we're still feeling the effects of the upcoming or recent election and president-elect nonsense. Um, as we say. uh, but yeah, I wondered that too. And I because a lot of the reports or studies and people wanting to learn more about is more about what we're talking about, but the specifics of like within China, that hasn't been brought up as much. But that is a very curious question to ask too. Like within China, are there laws in place now? Um, or did they just kind of make like an impulse decision to like stop everything, but not have the tools yet available for what are they gonna do now that they stopped it? It's like, good question.
Well, I just found something. I don't know if this is something that's new. It might be something that was already implemented
Mm-hmm.
before 2016, but what is the 4-2-1 Chinese family structure? This has led to the creation of a new term, the 4-2-1 generation, referring to the fact that one married couple, both of them singletons, will ultimately need to simultaneously care for four aging parents and one child.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, as you said earlier, one of the greatest impetus to reversing their own constitution of the one child mandate
Right.
was to have a generation to support the aging
Right.
grandparents. And they had that
Mm.
age gap. So all of a sudden, there were all these old people and no youths to take
To
care
take
of
care of
them.
them. Yeah.
And so that it's interesting that it's that they want people to take care of the elderly as opposed to while
Mm.
everyone is still young and fresh to just work on being a strong family unit. But no, I don't think there are
Yeah.
many countries on this earth that have mastered that, to be honest. Like they
Right.
haven't truly prioritized what family planning
Mm.
really is.
Mm. That's a really good point because that has been a focus a lot in like Chinese culture of uh multi-generational living within like one household too. But yeah, yeah, that's like where all the young people are gone. I've always thought of it in the sense of like, well, we're all repopulating kids of mixed backgrounds. Sorry, because that's who we meet. But it's like that's where we're at. It's like we're meeting and like repopulating with people who are not of pure blood or pure Chinese descent now. So I didn't think of I keep forgetting about the older generation and being taking care of them because that could also be the what I'm raised into, like American culture is like we are raised in a sense to like move out. You don't like go back and live with your parents. They don't come to live with you. Um, but yeah, I do forget about that. And that could also be with the policy from August, September that's like applications for stepchildren or biological relatives within 3 generations could be one of their caveats to be like, you can adopt as long as it's someone who's a stepchild or biologically related in 3 generations so that they can come and like take. So maybe that is one of their
Mhm.
things they considered in that sense, but I do agree. I think the question you raised earlier about like, well, is there other things to help like promote better family structure and healthier? I mean, it's China. I don't know about that. So it's doubtful, but
It's a very organized country. I
hmm
hope, but the problem, I think the pervading problem with a lot of these countries, the US included, is the fact that they're patriarchal.
yes.
And that is the that is the boundary, the hurdle between the government truly understanding what it takes to nurture a child. Because so
hmm
many of these men, historically speaking, did not have to nurture anyone.
Right.
They were
Yeah,
catered to. So, what do they know about family preservation?
exactly. Oh yeah. I
So,
mean, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
living in that, well, we're unfortunately now, I guess we've always been living in this age of, especially in America, of just like women do not have a right to their own body or decisions. So it's like we seem like we're in a more developed part of the world, but then like looking at back at it. So I think like in addition to the reaction specifically to the policy, it's like right after that was the election results. So like in America, yes, I think there's more just even more negative like anxiety versus I guess if the elections had went a different direction, maybe it wouldn't be as such an intense reaction and of anxiety. Um, but even I think even across the world, there probably is some sort of like uniform. Like we are more anxious now after seeing what's happening in that in America there. Like this policy is already, I guess it's not been overshadowed, but I almost think it's like a cat. It's like I think of it as like multiple smaller things just leading to like a bigger like movement maybe or a bigger event too. So I was like, yeah.
I think you're onto something there. I wonder if, and this is conspiracy theorizing, is that this law dropped because they knew that if this election goes a certain way, they needed to protect their children. I
Mm,
wonder if that's something, if there's something there.
honestly. Well, because we lived through the 2016 to 2020, so it's like, they're like, we have been planning this.
I know.
Wouldn't surprise me, and I mean, some people might have been like, nope, not listening to this anymore. But I do think there is like an element of like there, it's very it must have been, it seems like a surprise, but now that you say that, it's like it could have very well been calculated.
Mhm.
Um, and it's very likely, let's be honest, like, it's very likely. Uh, we just hear about it because it's such a big nation, but like it doesn't, and it's also like not to like make it more important than other international adoptions too, but um I almost think it's like maybe the way that it's been presented, it's because they're such a big nation, it's getting more emphasis. And it's more, I guess, like adding to that narrative or adding to that what is like adding fuel to the fire in a sense too. Uh
Mhm.
but yeah, because there's adoptees from everywhere. It's not just I guess it's just a big deal because China's so big.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
because Asian adoptees take up the bulk of international adoption.
Right.
And Korea, I think, is leading it. China is behind. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have Guatemala,
Mm-hmm.
Haiti, you have other South American countries, Colombia,
Mm-hmm.
and and then you have Russia, Ukraine, just simply because there's a war happening there and it's a
Right.
vulnerable country right now.
Yeah.
But and you then you have the continent of Africa where Ethiopian adoptees are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other countries that have a greater understanding of family preservation and do kinship adoptions, which is
Right.
what you are referring to, and which is, I think, the best resort
Mm,
unless there's abuse, unless there's no other recourse. But the
right.
way that adoption is framed now, it is plan A. And
Yeah.
it shouldn't be plan A. It shouldn't be plan A simply because family preservation needs to be at the apex of consideration.
Right.
And then we discuss how to keep the child in their culture. And
Mm-hmm.
then we discuss how to preserve the child's culture while still existing in another culture. We
Right.
don't just take a child from one culture, strip it of that culture, language, and background, and plop it in a completely different land, full of different people, full of different food, cultural references, and expect it to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
That should never be an option. But for some reason, that's plan A. I too was
Yeah.
adopted at age 4 from Haiti. And I I did not know English. I had to learn English. Did you know Chinese? Did you know Mandarin?
I knew it was like a dialect of some sort, but also did you speak French or no?
I spoke Creole. I spoke
Oh,
Creole.
Creole. Okay, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so I had to learn English when I came here, along with my
same.
sister
Yeah.
who was 5. And I came from an orphanage. Did you come from an orphanage as
Mm-hmm.
well?
Yeah. I mean, Social Welfare Institute, I think is like the PC term, PC term, I guess. I was calling it orphanage, and then they're like, it's called an SWI, and I was like, it's an orphanage. But yes, also from an
Yeah.
orphanage. I was not
Okay.
fostered. Yeah. I was
Mm-hmm.
surprised when I heard that fostering was so common in China. I was like, wait, really?
Yeah, that's
Um,
surprising to me too, because you just don't
yeah,
hear about it as much.
you
But
don't.
another element that I want to drop for people
Mm-hmm.
is the fact that adoption, I think, in the States and in Europe, in a lot of white cultures, is seen as a charitable deed, is an
Yes.
accolade. And that is something I really want people to push against because that's
Mm-hmm.
where the savior complex comes in. That's
Right.
when this idea of transracial adoption, which is the stripping away of someone's identity so that they can fit into another family, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to what I'm hearing from you, Tara, was the full embracing of your culture. You didn't fit into your family, you belonged in your
Mm-hmm.
family. They allowed you to maintain your cultural identity, which is excellent. They
Mm-hmm.
allowed you to flourish as a human being, knowing that you were different and celebrating in that difference, not omitting
Right.
it, not denying it, not diminishing it, but allowing you to be your full, authentic Chinese fabulousness. And that
Mm-hmm.
is something that you rarely hear about.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I definitely took it for granted when I started to talk to people too, like other Chinese adoptees or other transracial adoptees. It's like, nope, didn't have any exposure to like that aspect of my other like my birth country. And I was like, wow, that must be like really hard. I can't imagine that life because I just didn't have it. So, um, not to say like everything is like roses and rainbows here, but yeah, I definitely take it for granted in that sense too. But it's definitely like helped. I would say it's like it's all helped me become like more informed and be that person who created a podcast. It's like it is like being informed or having these experiences like made me someone who's like, all right, you might be a good contender for doing this podcast thing despite all the imposter syndroming that we feel sometimes here and there. Yeah, this was definitely a very valuable conversation too. I appreciated hearing
Yeah,
your perspective too, and I think you did a lot of like articulating some like thoughts subconsciously I've had, but haven't really voiced it yet. So it's gonna be great to like listen back and just share this. It's like you should hear this because like this other, she's not a Chinese adoptee, but she's also not adoptee internationally too. Like she gets it. Like she gets it.
yeah.
It's like.
Well, can you tell us some resources where people can learn more about you and also about just Chinese adoption or adoptees if they want to know more?
Yeah. Okay, so the one I mentioned already was Nanchang Project. They have resources. Also, it's the best one I found for resources relating to like DNA kits or like your birth search. They're a really good one. And that's spelled Nanchang. And I pulled it through because they have for Chinese adoption specifically, you have Chinese Children International, so CCI, and also I always want to call it by their former name, but they just changed their name. Uh, Chinese Children Alliance, CCA. I'm pretty sure. It used to be called FCC, which is Families with Children from China, but they rebranded essentially. Um, so now that's CCA. So those I think are really good ones for like Chinese adoptions focus. They have lots of resources listed, uh, and like documentaries and stuff you can watch. Can't say I've watched many of them, but they're very valuable. And then I can be found Adoptees Born in China podcast or Adoptees Born in China pod on Facebook and Instagram. Instagram primarily.